And I wanted to start by telling you about something that happened to me when I was 16. I remember we used to have a math teacher that we all loved. She would always sit cross-legged on the desk and teach us about really interesting stuff about math. Who knew that math would be so interesting? And we really loved her. And one day, before she entered the classroom, someone put a whoopee cushion where she was sitting. And as she was sitting on the desk, someone set off a stink bomb. And she got up and went and opened the window and she said, "Go ahead, laugh, enjoy yourself. Enjoy it while it lasts. You're 16 and it's appropriate, so have fun." And I remember thinking for myself, we're never going to change. Why should it change? I'm always going to be this way. But we do change and we don't stay that way. And in fact, actually I wanted to ask how many people here in the audience are teenagers? There's some teenagers here. And of those who are not teenagers, how many of you would be willingly be willing to go into a time machine and go back to the age of 16? Maybe one brave soul up there was willing to muster the courage to go back to that age. And there's a reason why we're so hesitant to go back to that age. It's not an easy age, and it's an age where there's many, many different transformations that go because the brain undergoes huge changes at that time. In fact, what happens is that there's a tremendous amount of pruning, which means a loss of neurons and loss of connections. And why would that happen? Why would the brain willingly give up some of its substance? But in a way, basically what's happening is the brain is giving up small roads to build up huge highways of information. So it will become much more efficient in its work. And as it becomes more efficient, tremendous things happen to our mind and to our abilities. All of a sudden, we're able to do things that we were not able to do before. Abstract thinking comes online. We're able to solve complicated problems. I wanted to give you an example. This is a recollection from David Bowie of how at 16, all of a sudden, he was really interested in philosophy and what is true and what is not true. And then a physics professor at 16 was actually able to build an electron accelerator in his garage. So it's really an age where the brain, even from a molecular perspective, can soak up new experiences and learn in an amazing way. And this is something that I've come to call the Taylor Swift effect. So Taylor Swift grew up in Pennsylvania, and she had the aspirations to become a singer. And she was an okay singer. She maybe won a few competitions, but she didn't do that well. But she seemed to have had a talent for songwriting. And at some point, her family, her parents, picked up the whole family, and they moved to Nashville, so she can study with the best people to become a songwriter. And then, so that was when she was a teenager at 14, 15, and by the time she was 19, she was a world-famous singer, songwriter. So I think it really emphasized to you that if a teenager, if you're able to hook them up on something that interests them, the sky is the limit. Because it's such an enormous apparatus and it's a time where everything changes and it depends on the environment. With the right stimulation, that's where the development goes. At the same time, what happens is that, interestingly, a lot of the same molecular principles or molecular actual molecules that are responsible for the formation of memory and learning, we now know are also responsible for the formation of addiction. And you can really actually think about addiction as a form of memory, as a form of very strong memory or very strong, almost intractable learning. And more findings find that in a way when adolescents and teenagers are exposed to drugs of abuse earlier on, again, that same system that learns really well, that soaks up new experiences, is diverted into that pathway of addiction, and people who are exposed to the earlier kids and adolescents are exposed to drugs of abuse, the higher the potential likelihood of addiction later on in life, and the more difficult recovery can be. A lot of the messages from the sort of establishment of how bad marijuana is were not so believable, and instead a whole shift in the attitudes towards marijuana has occurred, where it's become more and more acceptable for use for medicinal purpose as well as recreational purposes. With that, we see also the increasing in support for the legalization of marijuana. And in fact, 71% of millennials are in support of the legalization of marijuana. And it's now legal in 29 states to use medicinal marijuana. And in many, many states, including just recently California, marijuana is going to become legal for recreational use. But in fact, marijuana has also been very commonly used among adolescents. 45% of high school seniors have tried marijuana. About 40% of seniors have used marijuana in the last year. And a very alarming number, 6%, high school seniors use marijuana on a daily or almost daily basis. That means every day coming to school, either with the after effects of being high or being high. And that's very, very worrisome. And in fact, with less perceived risk, we see a higher increase in the daily use of marijuana. And you wonder, how can teenagers study and perform cognitive functions while being high on marijuana, which is one of the acute intoxication. One of the first things that goes is really some of the cognitive abilities to think and reason. The way and the potency of marijuana is also increasing dramatically, and there's now new methods of consumption. First of all, even the regular grass has up to 40% of THC content, which is the substance that causes the intoxication, tetrahydrocannabinol. But beyond that, there's butter, which has 70% THC, and then there's shatter, which is this. It's an odorless, less detectable extract of marijuana that has up to 80%. And that can be smoked with an EpiPen, and it has no odor. You can go to the bathroom, do a few puffs, and go back to class, basically. So the whole culture of how people use marijuana is changing dramatically. It's not the same 4% THC content that we saw in the 70s. It's really almost like it's a different product. So what is the problem? The problem is that marijuana can cause harm to the developing brain. It's been linked in studies to negative, long-term, possibly permanent consequences. It negatively affects brain maturation. So why is the adolescent brain more at risk than the adult brain? When something is developing and it has an exposure from the outside, either an insult, it can have very, very long-term consequences because it can alter and shift the development. Specifically, the endocannabinoid system undergoes major changes in adolescence. The endocannabinoid system, which THC works on, is responsible for many of brain functions. The number of endocannabinoid receptors in the brain is changing during adolescence. And exposure, when this is in flux, can potentially cause permanent brain changes in adulthood. It changes the baseline in adulthood. And that's what we see when we do studies that look into the structure of different components of the brain of people who were exposed to marijuana early on during adolescence. We see changes in the hippocampus, which is an area of the brain that's responsible for memory formation. We see changes in the amygdala, which is responsible for fear and emotions, and in the nucleus accumbens, which is responsible for motivation and reward. But it's not just changes in the structure. It's also changes in function. And this is just one example of one study, but there's many studies that show that early exposure to cannabis results in impaired in executive functioning. And when we say executive functioning, we mean the ability to reason, the ability to think abstractly, things that we use in everyday life, higher cognitive stuff, solving problems, thinking about different issues. And that is specifically impaired when in an early onset group of people who use marijuana, whereas the later onset, not so much. They're not indistinguishable from the control group. But apart from the cognition, there's also impairment in emotional functioning. The research really shows a lack of motivation. It shows an increased risk for anxiety, depression, and earlier onset psychosis, as well as an increase in the risk for future marijuana and other addictions. Because remember how I told you how this whole process of addiction is similar molecularly to memory and learning, and how the adolescent brain soaks up these new experiences. It's a brain designed to learn. And in general, with people who were exposed to early life marijuana, show a decrease in life satisfaction. And this is real. I just wanted to give you an example of a patient that I have in my practice. This is a 26-year-old woman. She's a very, very talented artist, but she has this ongoing feeling that everything is pointless, and she really lacks motivation and has trouble focusing. And she has a history of early social anxiety, and she used marijuana heavily, almost on a daily basis, to help her manage social situations. Is this a chicken or an egg problem? Does the early exposure to marijuana, is it the culprit, or is that the existing impairment? For example, this woman presents with anxiety, with impairing social anxiety and other impairments, whether that included together with the marijuana is the culprit. Animal studies can really help us answer this question because it allows us to establish causality and also to study potential molecular mechanisms. In animal studies, the only changing variable is marijuana, and we control how much we give the animals. We also control the interval of when we give it, and we also can stop marijuana for long intervals and see that even after a long time where the brain hasn't been exposed to marijuana, whether the insult in adolescence has long-term consequences. And indeed, a lot of the same findings that we find in the human populations, we find in animal studies. Here too, in these animals, we find that marijuana directly interferes with the function of the hippocampus, and it leads to memory and learning impairment in the animals, even months after they've been cleared away, the marijuana is cleared away from their body in adulthood. And it doesn't end only with cognition. Similarly to the findings in humans, it has also an effect on emotional functioning. And rats that were exposed to THC in adolescence display a decrease in willingness to seek favorite food as adults. So basically, what you do is you train them to push a lever in order to get a treat that they love, a sugar pellet, and they love sugar, like humans. And what happens, if you give these animals marijuana in adolescence, they're much less. They're not willing to work as hard towards those pellets, because what you do is that they have to press more and more in order to work harder, basically, to get the pellet, and they quit very, very quickly and very easily, even though they haven't really received the marijuana for a long time and it's been washed out of their system. There's also concern that, and you see there's certain tests in animals to test for anhedonia, which is the lack of enjoyment from things that happen in life. And you test that in animals by letting them, measuring how much they drink sugar water. And animals, like rats, that have been exposed to marijuana earlier on are much less willing to actually drink sugar water. They're not as interested in that, which is it's a very rewarding behavior for most rats. And also, you see an increase in anxiety and depressive symptoms. And again, we have specific tests to see and to measure anxiety and depressive symptoms in these animals. In addition, we see a disruption in the startle response, which researchers believe is something that mimics the likelihood of the risk for developing psychosis. So a lot of the same findings that we find in humans, we also find in these animal models. We also find additional things that we don't know yet in humans. There's a pretty significant gender differences, and that actually female animals are much more sensitive to the effects of adolescent marijuana exposure than their male counterparts. It affects their working memory, their spatial learning, their motivation, their depression. And we don't know that if that's actually true in humans too. So it gives us an opportunity to study other things in the human population. Another thing that we learned from the animal studies is that, and we actually now people are exploring that in humans, that the adolescent animals are less susceptible to the initial noxious effects of marijuana, because a lot of people, when they start using marijuana, actually feel very sick and don't feel very good, especially if they consume a lot of it. What we find is younger animals, at adolescents, can actually consume larger amounts of marijuana earlier on. And that is of concern because a lot of research suggests that the initial consumption and greater initial consumption can actually predispose you to more, to later addiction and later problem drug use. Still, there are a lot of unanswered questions, like what is the mechanism by which marijuana harms the adolescent brain? Is there a particular age in which the brain is most susceptible to marijuana? And can we reverse or prevent some of the harm? And in my lab, we're actively working to find out answers to these questions. Can marijuana be helpful? It's legal in 29 states as a medicinal product. So what is marijuana helpful for and what is it not helpful for? Marijuana is not a single drug. The best known constituent of marijuana is tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. But there's another constituent, and I think here maybe you're better versed at this because you have all these pot stores and they talk to you about what constituents are there and what is the different amounts of cannabidiol or THC is in the different strains. But the other constituent of marijuana is cannabidiol. And cannabidiol is an antagonist, a deactivator, can actually lessen the effect of THC. So most breeders try to create strains as high in THC as possible and low in CBD as possible. So this is comparing THC and CBD. THC impairs memory and learning. It has some anticonvulsant activity. It is very good for pain relief. And it is actually really good for increasing appetite. So really where THC can really be used is actually for pain relief and for people who have nausea and no appetite, primarily people who are getting chemotherapy treatments. It can be very useful, but it's actually CBD that has greater anticonvulsant activity. So for that parents for pot thing, it's really the CBD constituency that may work against seizures. And CBD is the one that has the anti-inflammatory abilities that can help with autoimmune diseases. And so it's really CBD that has the greater therapeutic effect for a myriad of different medical conditions. And I know now that there are certain pharmaceuticals who are creating an only CBD drug for seizure disorders and other disorders. So the question about the utility of pot in general, just like with primarily THC, for a lot of other conditions, there's no evidence that it can be helpful apart from those very specific symptoms of pain and nausea and loss of appetite. So I just wanted to go really quickly back to youth and cannabis. There's been a recent increase in daily cannabis use among older teens. And why is that? And then also how can we intervene? And being a child psychiatrist, I'm a big supporter of prevention and early intervention. Also having a special interest in our social ties, I think that the answer may lie in social experience. And I wanted to tell you a quick story that will actually make this point clearer. It has something to do with my father, actually, who at 72 years old quit smoking. And if you ask him how he quit smoking, he'll tell you that he did it by his sheer will force. And he had tried quitting smoking many times before. Throughout the years, he had tried acupuncture, he tried hypnosis, he tried different medications, and nothing helped. And finally, one day at 72, he was able to stop smoking. The way he did it, he got this quit line, and he called the quit line whenever he had cravings, and he talked to someone there. And it will be hard for my father to admit that. He's sort of like an army veteran. He was he was in an elite unit in the Israeli army. He's all tough. But he did have cravings, and he did call, and he did get support. And the research really shows that those people who call the quit hotline are 50% more likely to be able to quit smoking and to sustain quitting smoking. So it's really that ability to use others and to interact with others that can help prevent and overcome addiction. And I'm also saying prevent addiction because there's some studies that show that they took kids in the first grade and they had them sit together in groups. And that's in the first grade and work in groups of 6 as opposed to the regular way of sitting alone in a desk. And then they looked years later and they found that those who worked in a group were much less likely to engage in drug use. Part of what I'm trying to work on now is to design interventions that would help youth in general, and specifically also those with substance use, learn and train their social brain to become more secure, to use more what I call secure working models, to know how to ask for help, to know that things get better. Because no wonder a lot of people here shudder at the thought of going back to 16, because we gain so much wisdom over the years in understanding that things do get better, or understanding how to navigate social situations. There's so much science behind that that can be taught, and it's a very malleable system that can learn very quickly. And there's some interventions that show that even 1 hour of teaching teenagers certain social ideas about the brain and how the social brain can evolve can have an effect 9 months later on. So with that, I really want to thank you and really emphasize that daily use and the rise in daily use of marijuana, which seems to be as a result of the legalization of marijuana, is of huge concern. And in general, I really want you to take home that idea that it's a developing brain, and it's a brain that's open up to soaking up new experiences. And that experience can be learning to become an amazing songwriter, or unfortunately diverting the brain towards another track, a track of potential mental illness and addiction. So I just will take another quick moment, and I do this in all my talks now because government funding for scientific research is at a record low in the United States. We need your support to continue our work. And if anybody wants more information about this work, they can always email me. So thank you very much.